The more I dig into Brian Hooker, the more my skin crawls. I've brought in Steve and Carly to help us. Carly Ainsworth is the victim's daughter. She has plenty to reveal about our findings, and her boyfriend Steve Hansen is backing her up. He has his own testimony. I have verified evidence for every single claim I have made. Every word of my report is backed by hard facts. Listen, no conviction does not mean no crime. You can be guilty as sin without a verdict ever being reached. When multiple witnesses watch an event unfold, you cannot just scrub it from reality. The truth remains. If they claim choking your child once is not abuse, it does not change the physical reality of hands around a throat. Her mother even has photographic proof bruises across her back, a direct result of Brian's aggression on that boat. He had her pinned against the cockpit of the sailboat during the assault. Carly insists her mother had flaws, but lying was not one of them. She claims Lynette never once spoke a falsehood. Even her father can confirm that. According to him, she never told a single lie. She did some confusing things, sure, but she was honest. I asked Carly if she had seen Brian's violent side. She saw him choke her and toss her from the room. I wondered what being in custody felt like while the search continued. He described it as a specific, agonizing circle of hell within a much larger nightmare he is still living. He is still in it. He kept saying, "I have no wife." He claimed she belonged to him and insisted they shared a deep, incomparable love. Half their lives spent together. He says his only mission now is to find where Lynette went. If someone falls into the dark water, the ocean is not quiet. It always leaves a signature behind. The current drags objects one way while the wind pushes them toward a predictable destination. Eventually, the tide brings everything back to the shore. That is not a guess, it is how the sea operates. Usually when a person vanishes beneath the waves, the water yields something, a clue or a body. An object, a sign, some kind of resolution. But with Lynette Hooker, everything defied the laws of physics. No trace was found, and nothing moved as nature intended. Nothing matched the story Brian was telling us. When we fed the data into our systems and simulated that night, the experts reached a chilling conclusion. Their findings were not just unlikely, they were impossible. It was not just that she had not been found. If his story were true, a trail would exist. There was nothing. That is when our investigation turned cold. When science contradicts a statement, I have to ask, did Lynette Hooker ever actually go into that water? Or was that tale just a distraction from a far more sinister reality? Before you and I go further, you and I need to look closer. These details are not just trivia, they are the key to solving this disappearance. What I am laying out is not a story, it is a cold series of forensic facts. When these pieces fit together, they will shift your entire perspective on this disappearance. April 4th, 2026, Abaco, Bahamas. A woman was reported missing from the surrounding waters. Her name was Lynette Hooker. The only witness was her husband, a man named Brian Hooker. Brian claims that while they were taking a small dinghy back to their boat, Soulmate Lynette fell overboard. He said she vanished instantly in rough conditions. He claimed to have searched frantically for her. He yelled her name and did everything he could, or so he told the local authorities at the time. Was she buried somewhere? I needed answers. I consulted drift pattern experts. They have mapped every possible movement for that specific night. Considering the wind and the tide, they told me his account is a physical impossibility. There is no way. If Brian is telling the truth and she went over the side where he said she could not have vanished, her body would have absolutely been recovered within the Sea of Abaco. It is as simple as that. Think of it as a giant swimming pool. You would have spotted her immediately. Or she would have washed up on the eastern shores of Elbow Cay near the Tilu Cut. If she was pulled out toward the Atlantic, the patterns would have pushed her back eventually. She would have landed on the north or south end of that cut. Science says there is no other possibility. The official report lists it as an accident at sea, a tragic event blamed on uncontrollable nature. But as an investigator, I know that when dealing with the ocean, these stories rarely stay so simple. You see, the ocean isn't just empty space, it's a calculated system that follows rigid physical laws. Every current has a direction, every wind a trajectory, and the tides, they follow strict cycles. When something enters that water, it almost always leaves a signature behind for us to find. To this day, Lynette is still missing. We have no confirmation of where she actually ended up. There is no physical evidence in the file placing her in any area that fits the original theory. I must emphasize that as of now, no formal criminal charges have been filed against anyone involved. Right now, two parallel investigations are active, involving the Royal Bahamas Police and the United States Coast Guard. These agencies are scrubbing every byte of data, including forensic evidence from equipment found at the scene. My colleagues are re-examining witness statements alongside the environmental conditions present during that night. Let's be clear the facts. Don't come from rumors but from official records and verified reports. We are strictly following the paper trail investigation files, participant accounts, and hard verifiable data. But when you and I look at these pieces together, a much clearer picture starts to emerge. It is not a final conclusion yet, but a collection of details that just don't seem to fit. It is these glaring inconsistencies that forced us to look far beyond a simple maritime accident. In any maritime case, there is one crucial element: we cannot ignore the science of the drift model. This isn't guesswork. It's a data-driven analytical method used by every professional search and rescue team. Forensic experts don't start with the stories people tell. They start with the environment itself. They factor in that night's wind speed shifts in direction and the specific currents around the Abaco area. We look at the precise tidal cycles mapped against the exact moment this incident allegedly took place. When combined, these factors create a reliable model that predicts exactly where an object should drift. When that data is processed, it's not vague. It doesn't offer many paths, just one specific range. Following that model, if a body actually entered the water at the time Brian described then, there are only two possible landing spots. First, the Sea of Abaco, a shallow and nearly enclosed basin. Second, the eastern shore near Tilu Cut, where the currents naturally wash everything onto the banks. There is no third option. Objects don't just drift aimlessly or vanish into thin air out there. My experts even account for things people overlook, like the natural process of decay over time. They study the impact of marine life and how materials like clothing or personal items separate. And their forensic conclusion is always the same. In any scenario, some part of the evidence must surface. It might not be everything, but there will be traces, a scrap of fabric, or a floating object. There should be a sign of her presence, but after days of searching with multiple agencies involved, no body, no clothing, and no confirmed traces were ever found in the model's target zones. This total absence isn't just a failure to find her, it's becoming a significant data point itself. Because when science doesn't match the reality we see on the ground, we have only two options. Either our physics is wrong or the claim that she ever entered that water is false. At this point, the case stops being a simple accident. It becomes a major investigative problem. It's a problem where every new fact makes the original story much harder for me to believe. That's why in Lynette's case, the question isn't just about where she might be located today. The real question you and I must ask is whether she was ever in those waters at all. Brian's statement says he left the Abaco Inn with Lynette at approximately 7:30 that evening. But that is a full 30 minutes after we see him on camera walking down to the dock. They allegedly clear White Sound Channel and turn left heading south along the shore of Elbow Cay. He says the waves were rough and dark, but darkness doesn't actually fall until nearly 8 p.m. I have personally been on that dock for 5 days straight, measuring the light. Visibility remains until 8. At 8 p.m., you sat there and told me your wife just bounced out of the dinghy. I might have believed you since it was dark. You and I are looking at surveillance from the Abaco Inn that caught a detail small enough to miss but critical to this case. The digital records show that Brian and Lynette Hooker left the premises at exactly 6:38 p.m. That is a verifiable timestamp, not a foggy memory or an emotional account, but a hard piece of recorded data. However, in Brian's statement to my team, he claimed they didn't head out until roughly 7:30 p.m. That is a discrepancy of 52 minutes. In a normal day, 52 minutes might not mean much at all. But in a criminal investigation, 52 minutes is a window where the most critical events usually unfold. Because in that nearly hour-long gap, everything could have happened or nothing at all. That is why this specific lapse in time is something we need to clarify immediately. We didn't stop there. Another video clip from 7 p.m. adds yet another layer of data to the pile. In this frame, we see Brian moving toward the dock, which matches the route he gave us in his statement. But here is the problem: Lynette never appears in the frame. There is zero visual confirmation that she was there. She isn't behind him, and we have no independent way of confirming her exact position at that moment. This alone doesn't prove anything, but when we stack it against that 6:38 p.m. timestamp and his 7:30 p.m. story, it forces us to ask a very specific, very haunting question. Where was Lynette between 6:38 and 7 p.m.? This isn't just a minor detail in our timeline. This is the only window where the digital evidence and the husband's account are in total conflict. No cameras saw her, and no one in the public can confirm where she was during those missing minutes. You and I know these as windows of uncertainty, the gaps where the truth remains cold and undetermined. Sometimes it is precisely these gaps that tell us the most. It isn't always about what the footage shows, but because they show what remains unexplained. She was a safety nut who always wore her life jackets. She was careful and respected the ocean, checking the weather stations religiously before every trip. The idea that she just fell off this dinghy and was unable to swim back, it doesn't track for me. Lynette and Brian Hooker had been married for 25 years, living a life almost entirely off the grid. In 2020, they liquidated their lives, sold the house and everything they had ever owned. The boat was the dream. They ditched every possession to live on the water, a lifestyle that few truly understand. To this day, we have no official data that fully explains what happened during that 52-minute period. No extra footage has been confirmed, and the investigation hasn't produced a more detailed breakdown of those minutes. That is why you and I have to keep asking this question. It isn't a conclusion, just a massive loose end. When every second counts, an unexplained hour of time is never just a small detail to a detective. It is a piece of the puzzle that remains missing, leaving the entire picture incomplete. Earlier that night near the pool at the Abaco Inn, witnesses described a scene that felt out of place. According to my reports, Brian Hooker was standing alone near the edge, staring out at the open water. He wasn't just there for a moment, he stood there long enough for the people around him to take notice. Meanwhile, Lynette was in a different section of the inn, standing nowhere near her husband. Witnesses saw no conversation between them. She seemed to be on her own, separated from him for most of that time. These observations don't confirm a crime on their own, of course. But as an investigator, I look closely at how a couple interacts during those final critical hours. My witnesses described Brian's demeanor as unusual, not in a specific way, but a feeling they couldn't shake. It was a feeling that was hard to describe. He didn't communicate much at all. He didn't fit the vacation vibe. He seemed entirely focused on one thing, the ocean stretched out before him. Now, these are subjective accounts, and I have to weigh them against the hard data we've collected. However, there is a much more specific detail regarding the clothes he was wearing. One witness was certain that when Brian first hit the bar, he was in a blue and white striped shirt. When he returned to our view, that shirt was gone. Subsequent surveillance footage then caught him wearing a different color entirely, perhaps grey or light brown. 3 separate outfits in a single night. Normally that wouldn't set off any alarms. People change clothes for a dozen ordinary reasons. But when we scrub a timeline, every wardrobe change gets logged. It's not about guessing, it's about making sure nothing is overlooked. In my line of work, the smallest details often scream the loudest. These are the threads that finally stitch a cold case together. Right now, witness statements aren't facts, they are just leads. You and I are building a mosaic here, piece by piece. Records show Brian Hooker has given several different versions. He's offered conflicting accounts of how Lynette supposedly went overboard. At first glance, you might think it's just semantic hair-splitting. But look closer and you'll find a massive fracture in the narrative. It all comes down to where Lynette was heading in that water. Initially, Brian told my colleagues she was swimming straight for the shoreline. That's vital, it dictates where the dive teams and rescue crews look. It changes the entire context of what happened next. But then a recorded phone call changed the story. Brian gave a completely different direction. Suddenly, she wasn't swimming to land, but back toward the bigger boat. That isn't just a simple slip of the tongue. Those are literal opposites. One path leads to safety on the beach. The other path drags her deeper away. Interestingly, his later messages kept focusing on that vessel. He completely abandoned the idea that she ever swam for the shore. What we're left with is a tangled web of contradictory statements. The truth shifted with every retelling. As an investigator, this kind of shifting narrative is a red flag. Let's look at consistency together before we jump to any conclusions. Sure, trauma can cloud a memory, I've seen it happen. But core facts like location shouldn't just vanish into thin air. When the compass needle flips, the entire investigation breaks. In this room, Lynette's path isn't a footnote, it is the case. It's the one domino that knocks over everything following it. Was she fighting for the shore or struggling back to the boat? Those scenarios paint very different pictures of her death. Reconstructing a crime scene is impossible when the foundations are crumbling. Discrepancies don't prove guilt, but they certainly demand an explanation. Once the core story starts to rot, credibility isn't far behind. Thankfully, digital footprints don't lie and they don't have emotions. In this investigation, Lynette's Apple Watch became a silent, crucial witness. It was found aboard the Soulmate, which raises some very uncomfortable questions. We also have the vessel's AIS identification system. That unit pings its GPS coordinates every few seconds. Importantly, these coordinates are saved on the boat and tracked by both satellites and ground stations. Every signal sent out leaves a breadcrumb, creating a permanent independent record of activity. These digital traces can't just be wiped or altered. To us, this is the gold standard. We call this digital exhaust the invisible footprints left behind in the machines. They aren't pressed into the dirt, but burned deep into the server's memory. They don't fade, and unlike a suspect's story, they never change their tune. We pull them to rebuild the timeline piece by piece until the truth surfaces. Beyond the AIS, we've seized every electronic device on that vessel for forensic imaging. We grabbed the phone's cameras and every hard drive we could find. Lab analysis is underway. While we haven't released the full report, the early signs are telling. In this case, you and I must realize that words only go so far. There's the data. In a mess like this, binary code often tells a much cleaner story than any witness could. To understand the end, we have to look closely at how the fuse was lit. Crimes rarely start at the climax. Usually the real story begins weeks before the tragedy. Statements from Lynette's inner circle have given us several critical points to investigate. First, she bought a plane ticket to see her mother, but she never made it to the gate. It's not a smoking gun, but a missed flight suggests a sudden, perhaps forced change of plans. Second, we heard reports that she was documenting her own bruises with a camera. Those photos weren't for social media. They were a private ledger of her pain and survival. A grim reminder of what she endured. Remember, these are details coming from those closest to her. 2 years back, a drunken argument turned violent. He allegedly wrapped his hands around her throat. He pinned her against a seat, leaving her back a mess of deep, dark bruising. The next day she called me. I still remember her voice while she was stuck on that boat. He told me he wished he'd finished the job and just tossed me into the ocean. Nobody would have found me. Was it a text no she called and said those exact words? Whenever she nearly walked out, she'd confess how deeply embarrassed she felt about the whole situation. That shame is likely why she kept the abuse hidden behind a veil of silence for so long. This isn't a legal verdict yet. These are the threads of context we use to weave the truth. Third, there are texts. A simple, chilling sentence, "I will not be coming back." It's only 5 words, but the weight behind them is heavy with desperation and finality. As detectives, we know those words mean nothing without knowing the circumstances of that moment. We have to anchor that statement to its proper time and place. Most of this surfaced through the press, fueled by the accounts of those who knew her best. It isn't a final judgment or hard evidence vetted by a court. Not yet, at least. But when you stack these stories against the timeline of April 4th, things change. Combined with the digital forensics, we start to see a very specific, very dark pattern emerging. Context doesn't give us the who yet, but it tells us exactly what questions to ask. You and I know one detail is just a dot. It tells no story alone. But connect those dots and the entire picture of what happened out there shifts. The past might not explain the murder directly, but we can't just look away from it. 2 days after Lynette vanished, a camera caught a curious interaction on the deck of the Soulmate. Brian Hooker is seen leaning over the rail chatting with a neighbor who happened to be passing by. It's a brief exchange, remarkably mundane given the circumstances. He just explains his version of events. He sounds steady, collected. There's no frantic edge to his voice, no sign he's losing his grip. I've learned that a calm voice isn't a confession. People react to trauma in strange, unpredictable ways. Shock wears many masks. Some scream while others go completely cold. Some people go silent or get eerily calm, but what makes this tape noteworthy isn't how he tells the story, but a tiny, jarring detail that surfaces right after he finished. During our review, Brian mentions a boat issue. He says he might need some help too. Haul up the anchor. A brief remark, a technicality totally detached from the tragedy, but mentioning it then creates a chill because at that exact moment the search was still active. Lynette was still missing. We were all focused on finding her. The situation was desperate. Her fate was unknown and everyone present was fixated on one thing: what happened to her. In that high-stakes environment, pivoting to a trivial topic like an anchor creates a massive contrast. It isn't a crime. It isn't even unusual on its own, but it is a detail that forces me to stop and think. You and I have to wonder, was that nerves or calculation? Was it an honest moment or a calculated psychological shift? We have to weigh it carefully. Remember, this footage is just one fragment of a much larger puzzle. It's not the whole story. It doesn't show the full context or the events that unfolded in the hours and days later. We can't use it to close the case just yet, but during an investigation, these anomalies are what we look for, not because they are proof, but because they expose how narratives form. Sometimes it is the irrelevant things that help clarify a case. In this specific instance, mentioning the anchor might be a technicality or a tactical distraction from the real questions. It is a pivot to the mundane while the world is screaming for answers about a disappearance. So far, the divers have found nothing. The timeline is fractured. The stories keep shifting. My team is still analyzing data while two separate investigations continue. All official conclusions are pending. One thing is clear: this isn't a simple disappearance. When time and location don't align, things change. If the fundamental facts don't fit, we have to ask ourselves, are we seeing the full picture? If Lynette Hooker wasn't in those waters, then our investigation has to start from scratch elsewhere. In cases like this, we're not just piecing together facts, we're hunting for behavioral signs in life. Sometimes the biggest warning signs aren't obvious. They don't scream, they are quiet and subtle. It could be a gut feeling, a shift in tone, or a small remark repeated too often. These are the clues people overlook until it's too late. I tell everyone, trust your survival instincts. If something feels wrong, it usually is. Pay attention to the things that make you feel unwell. You might not be able to explain it, but your intuition is often ahead of the evidence. If you find yourself in a situation that feels dangerous or wrong, reach out for help immediately. Talk to family, friends, or the authorities. Your safety matters more than any code of silence. Stay alert. I am part of an investigative team committed to uncovering the truth in these cases. We work to provide clear investigative insights, focusing on the hard facts and the available evidence. Everything we discuss here is pulled from public records and reliable investigative sources available to us. We aren't here to judge or accuse. Every person mentioned is innocent until a court decides otherwise. That is the standard: innocent until proven guilty by the competent authorities in a court of law. Investigations are fluid. Facts may change, and while we strive for accuracy, some errors can happen. This analysis is for informational purposes only. Be warned, some details and images here are sensitive. Consider your well-being before you continue. If you value this deep dive, join our community today. Subscribe to stay updated as we follow the evidence and peel back the layers of this mystery.